There are stories that history swallows whole, not because they are too small to matter, but because they are too dangerous to survive. Somewhere along the low country of South Carolina, on a plantation that no longer bears a name on any official map, there was a man who sat at the table of his master every single evening for nearly 11 years. He ate from the same china. He drank from the same crystal. He was served by the same hands that served the white family seated around him. And not one person, not the overseer, not the neighbors, not the visiting ministers, not the county sheriff, ever said a word about it. Not one. For decades, the people who knew about this arrangement refused to speak of it. The few written records that touched on the subject were removed from the county courthouse sometime around 1879, during a fire that locals still argue was not entirely accidental. What remained were fragments. A letter here, a ledger entry there, a single deposition buried inside a probate dispute that no one thought to look at for over 60 years. What those fragments revealed, when finally pieced together, was not a story of kindness. It was not a story of redemption. It was something far more unsettling than either of those things. A story of calculation so precise, so patient, and so quietly devastating that it still defies easy explanation. Before we continue with the story of Harlan Voss and the man who sat at his table, if you've never been to this channel before, welcome. And if you have, you already know what kind of place this is. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, and tell us in the comments, where in the world are you listening from tonight? Because this story, I promise you, is one you will not forget. Now, let us go back to the beginning, to the Carolina Low Country, to the year 1847, and to a plantation called Grayfield. The parish of St. Helena, in Beaufort District, South Carolina, sat at the edge of the world as most Americans understood it in the middle of the 19th century. It was a place of extraordinary, almost violent beauty. Long, flat stretches of marsh grass that turned gold in the autumn light, rivers the color of dark tea, live oaks draped so heavily in Spanish moss that they seemed to be slowly pulling themselves back into the earth. The air smelled of salt and mud and something older, something that had no name in the English language, but that every person who lived there, white or black, free or enslaved, recognized immediately upon returning from any time away. It was the smell of the low country, and it meant you were home, whether you wanted to be or not. Grayfield Plantation sat on approximately 900 acres of this land, most of it given over to Sea Island cotton, the long staple variety that fetched the highest prices on the market in Charleston and, through Charleston, in Liverpool and Manchester. Sea Island cotton was not like the short staple variety grown further inland. It required an almost surgical attention to detail at every stage of its cultivation, from the careful selection of seed, to the precise timing of the harvest, to the delicate process of ginning, which had to be done slowly and by hand to preserve the length of the fiber. It was, in other words, a crop that demanded skilled labor, skilled, knowledgeable, experienced labor. The man who owned Grayfield in 1847 was named Harlan Voss. He was 43 years old that year, a second-generation planter whose father had come down from Virginia with a small inheritance and an enormous appetite for land. Harlan had inherited both the land and the appetite, and over the course of 20 years he had expanded Grayfield from its original 400 acres to nearly twice that size, buying up neighboring parcels as their owners fell into debt or died without heirs. He was not a cruel man in the theatrical sense. He did not take pleasure in suffering for its own sake, did not drink himself into rages, did not make a spectacle of his authority. He was, by the standards of his time and place, considered a reasonable man, a practical man, a man who understood that a plantation ran on efficiency and that efficiency required a certain kind of order. His wife, Margaret Voss, was 38, the daughter of a rice planter from Georgetown. She was a quiet woman, not cold exactly, but contained, the kind of person who expressed strong feeling only in private, if at all. She had given Harlan 3 children, a son named Thomas, who was 17 in 1847 and already being groomed to take over the management of the plantation. A daughter named Clara, who was 14 and being educated at home by a succession of tutors from Charleston. And a younger son named William, who was 9 and still largely in the care of the household staff. The household staff at Grayfield consisted of approximately 14 enslaved people who worked inside the main house or in the immediate domestic sphere, cooking, cleaning, laundering, tending the gardens, driving the carriages, caring for the children. Beyond them, there were somewhere between 80 and 100 enslaved people who worked the fields, the cotton house, the stables, and the various outbuildings that made up the working infrastructure of the plantation. The exact number fluctuated, as it did on most plantations of this size, due to births, deaths, sales, and the occasional hiring out arrangement with neighboring properties. Among all of these people, there was one man whose position at Grayfield defied every category that the plantation system had created to contain him. His name was Cato. He had no surname, or rather he had no surname that anyone at Grayfield acknowledged. He was simply Cato, and had been since the day he arrived at the plantation as a boy of perhaps 12 or 13, purchased at a Charleston auction house in the spring of 1832. No one knew exactly where he had come from before that. The auction records listed him as having been part of a lot sold by the estate of a deceased planter in Colleton District, but the estate records themselves were incomplete and the trail went cold there. What was known about Cato by the time our story begins in earnest was this. He was approximately 27 or 28 years old. He was tall, unusually tall for the era, well over 6 feet, with a lean, angular build and hands that seemed almost too large for his body, the kind of hands that belonged to someone who had spent years doing precise, demanding work. He had a face that people remembered without being able to say exactly why. Not conventionally handsome, not striking in any obvious way, but with a quality of stillness to it, a quality of attention that made you feel when he looked at you that he was seeing considerably more than you intended to show. He had been, for the past several years, the head driver at Grayfield, the enslaved man responsible for overseeing the work of the field hands, for maintaining the pace and quality of the cotton harvest, for serving as the primary intermediary between the enslaved community and the white overseer, a man named Denton Frick, who had held the position for 6 years and who, by all accounts, was considerably less competent at his job than the man nominally beneath him. This was not an unusual arrangement. On many large plantations throughout the Low Country, the head driver was the person who actually understood how the operation worked, who knew which fields were ready to pick and which needed another week, who knew which workers were reliable and which needed watching, who knew the rhythms and the weather and the soil in a way that no white overseer, newly arrived from somewhere else, could possibly replicate. The driver was indispensable, and indispensability in the plantation economy was a form of power. Limited, constrained, always conditional, but real. Cato had understood this from a very young age. What no one at Grayfield fully understood, not yet, was the precise nature and extent of what Cato had been doing with that understanding for the better part of a decade. The arrangement began, as best as anyone could later reconstruct it, in the autumn of 1847. The cotton harvest that year had been extraordinary. The long summer rains had come at exactly the right intervals. The sea winds had stayed mild through August, and the bolls had opened full and white across every field at Grayfield. By the time the picking was done and the cotton had been ginned and baled and sent down to Charleston, Harlan Voss was looking at a profit that exceeded anything he had seen in the previous 5 years combined. He was, by any measure, a wealthy man that autumn, wealthier than he had been in years, and in a mood that his household described, in the careful language of people who had learned to read their master's temperament like a barometer, as expansive. It was in this mood of expansiveness that Harlan Voss did something that no one at Grayfield had ever seen him do before. He invited Cato to dine with him, not in the kitchen, not in the overseer's quarters, At the main table, in the dining room of the house, with the family silver laid out and the candles lit, and the household staff moving quietly around the edges of the room, with the practiced invisibility that domestic service required. The invitation was delivered by Thomas Voss, who was 17 and who clearly found the entire business uncomfortable in a way he could not quite articulate. He came to the cotton house where Cato was finishing the last of the season's tallies, long columns of figures in a ledger that Cato kept with a precision that Denton Frick had long since stopped pretending to understand, and he stood in the doorway for a moment before speaking. "My father wants you at supper tonight," Thomas said. At the house, Cato looked up from the ledger. His expression did not change. "Yes, sir," he said. That was all. No question, no hesitation, no visible surprise. He closed the ledger, set down his pen, and that evening he appeared at the dining room of the main house at precisely the hour that supper was served, wearing the cleanest clothes he owned, his hands scrubbed to the wrist. He sat at the table. He ate. He spoke when spoken to, and what he said was, by the account of the one household servant who later described the evening in any detail, measured, precise, and entirely without the performative deference that characterized most interactions between enslaved people and their enslavers in that time and place. He did not shuffle. He did not look at the floor. He answered Harlan Voss's questions about the harvest with the same directness he would have used with the overseer. And when Harlan asked him a question about the soil composition of the eastern fields, a question that Denton Frick could not have answered, Cato answered it in a way that made Harlan Voss sit back in his chair and look at him for a long moment before nodding slowly. Margaret Voss said almost nothing throughout the meal. Thomas watched Cato with an expression that hovered somewhere between fascination and unease. Clara kept her eyes on her plate. Young William, who had not been told anything unusual was happening, simply ate his supper and asked to be excused. When the meal was over, Harlan Voss thanked Cato for his work that season and told him he would receive an additional allocation of provisions for his household. Cato thanked him in return, stood, and left. The next evening, Cato was at the table again. No one had invited him a second time. He simply appeared at the same hour, in the same clothes, and sat in the same chair. Harlan Voss looked at him for a moment when he entered the room, and then... And this was the detail that the household servant who witnessed it could never quite explain, even years later. Harlan Voss nodded, as if this were expected, as if it had been agreed upon. And so it continued. Night after night through the autumn of 1847 and into the winter, Cato appeared at the table of Harlan Voss. He ate with the family. He participated in the conversation when invited to do so, and remained silent when he was not. He was served by the same household staff who served the Voss family, and those staff members, who were themselves enslaved, who had their own complex and carefully maintained hierarchies and relationships, did not speak of it. Not to each other, not to the overseer, not to the field hands. The silence around the arrangement was, from the very beginning, absolute. Word reached the neighboring plantations within weeks. It could not have been otherwise. The Low Country was a small world, and the movement of information through it was as constant and as difficult to stop as the tidal flow through the marsh. Neighbors heard, ministers heard, the county sheriff, a man named Aldous Prewitt, heard, and not one of them said a word to Harlan Voss about it. This was, perhaps, the most disturbing detail of all. In a society built on the absolute enforcement of racial hierarchy, a society in which the act of a black man sitting at a white man's table was not merely a social transgression, but a challenge to the entire architecture of the world as it existed in St. Helena Parish in 1847. The silence of the community was not natural. It was not comfortable. It was the silence of people who had decided, for reasons they did not discuss openly, that whatever was happening at Greyfield was something they did not want to look at too directly. The question that no one asked out loud. The question that sat at the center of everything, like a stone at the bottom of a dark river, was simple. What did Cato know? To understand what Cato knew, you have to understand something about the world he had grown up in. He had arrived at Greyfield as a boy in 1832, at a moment when the plantation was still in the process of establishing itself. Harlan Voss's father, Edmund Voss, was still alive then, a harder man than his son, by most accounts, and one with a more direct relationship to the violence that underpinned the system he had built his life upon. Edmund Voss had come down from Virginia with money and ambition, and a set of beliefs about the natural order of things that he held with the certainty of a man who has never had occasion to question them. Cato had watched Edmund Voss for 3 years before the old man died of a fever in the summer of 1835. He had watched the way the plantation worked. Not just the cotton, not just the fields, but the whole machinery of it. The way information moved, the way decisions were made, the way power was distributed and maintained and occasionally, carefully, transferred. He had watched Harlan Voss inherit that machinery and begin slowly to make it his own. And he had begun, from a very early age, to learn things. Not in any dramatic or conspiratorial sense, not at first. He learned because learning was what he did. The way some people breathe or sleep or eat. He learned the cotton, the soil, the seed, the weather, the timing of everything. He learned the ledgers, watching over the shoulder of the overseer who preceded Denton Frick, a man named Garland, who was careless with his books and who did not notice the boy who swept the floor of the cotton house, paying close attention to the columns of figures. He learned to read, not from any teacher, not through any formal arrangement, but through a process of patient, solitary observation that took years and that he never spoke of to anyone. He learned other things too, things that were harder to categorize. He learned the shape of Harlan Voss's debts. This was not difficult if you knew where to look and had the patience to look carefully. The plantation economy of the antebellum South was built on credit, on loans from Charleston factors, on advances against future harvests, on the complex web of financial obligation that connected every planter in the Low Country to every other planter, and to the merchant houses that financed them all. Harlan Voss was no exception. He owed money to a factor named Cornelius Haig, who operated out of a counting house on East Bay Street in Charleston. He owed money to a land agent in Beaufort. He had borrowed against the value of several of his enslaved workers to finance the purchase of the Eastern Fields in 1843, a transaction that had left him, for a period of nearly 2 years, in a position of considerable financial vulnerability. Cato knew about all of this. He had pieced it together over years, from fragments, overheard conversations, ledger entries glimpsed through open doors, the careful reading of documents that passed through the cotton house in the ordinary course of business. He had assembled a picture of Harlan Voss's financial situation that was, by 1847, more complete and more accurate than anything Harlan Voss himself could have produced from memory. But that was not the most important thing Cato knew. The most important thing Cato knew had nothing to do with money. It had to do with a man named Reginald Haverstock. Reginald Haverstock was a planter from Colleton District, the same district where Cato had originated before the auction in Charleston. He was a man of approximately Harlan Voss's age, and he and Harlan had known each other since childhood, their families having been connected through the overlapping social networks of the Low Country planter class. They were not close friends. There was something between them that had always prevented genuine closeness, some old tension or rivalry that neither man spoke of directly, but they moved in the same circles, attended the same church in Beaufort, sat on the same county committees. In the spring of 1846, Reginald Haverstock had come to Greyfield on what he described as a social visit. He had stayed for 3 days. On the second night of his visit, something had happened. Something that had taken place in the study of the main house, late at night, after the household had retired. Cato had been awake. He was often awake late, working in the cotton house by lamplight on the season's accounts. The cotton house was close enough to the main house that sound carried, on a still night, through the open windows. He had heard what happened in that study. He had not told anyone, not then, not for a long time afterward. He had simply filed it away, with the same careful precision with which he filed away everything else he learned. And he had waited. Patience, in the world Cato inhabited, was not a virtue. It was a survival strategy. It was the only form of power available to a person in his position. The power of knowing when not to act, of holding something in reserve until the moment when it would matter most. By the autumn of 1847, the harvest season, that moment had arrived. If you've been listening closely, you already sense that what Cato heard through that open window was something that Harlan Voss could not afford to have known. And you're right. But the full shape of it, the precise nature of what passed between those two men in that study, and what it meant for everyone at Greyfield, that is something we will come to. Because to understand it properly, you need to understand first what Cato did with what he knew and how he did it, and why the entire community of St. Helena Parish chose to look the other way. And that story is considerably more complicated than it might appear. The second CTA belongs here naturally at this moment of suspended revelation. And so, if this story is already pulling at you, if you're already asking yourself what Cato heard through that window and what it cost him to keep it, then you know exactly what kind of channel this is. Like this video, leave us a comment with your theory. What do you think Cato knew? And subscribe if you haven't already. We'll be right here. Now, back to Greyfield and to the winter of 1847. The arrangement at the dinner table had, by December of that year, become something that the household had absorbed into its routines, the way the body absorbs a foreign object. Not comfortably, not without cost, but with a kind of grim adaptation that was, in its own way, more disturbing than open conflict would have been. The household staff served Cato without comment. Thomas Voss ate his supper in silence, watching. Margaret Voss had developed the habit of directing her conversation exclusively toward her husband or her children, as if Cato's presence at the table were a weather condition, something to be endured rather than acknowledged. Denton Frick, the overseer, had said nothing at all. This was perhaps the most telling silence of all, because Frick was not a man who was naturally inclined toward silence. He was a man who expressed his opinions freely and frequently, who had strong views about the proper order of things on a plantation, and who was not shy about enforcing them. The fact that he had looked at the situation at Greyfield's dinner table and chosen deliberately to say nothing, this spoke to something. It spoke to the fact that Frick, whatever his limitations, was not stupid. He had looked at the situation and made a calculation, and the calculation had told him to keep his mouth shut. What that calculation was based on, Frick never said. But there were people at Greyfield who had their suspicions. Among the enslaved community, the reaction to Cato's new position was complex and layered in ways that the white members of the household could not have fully understood even if they had tried. There was certainly a degree of awe. The sheer audacity of what Cato had apparently managed to arrange for himself was not lost on anyone who understood the world they all lived in. But there was also unease, and something that in some quarters shaded into resentment. Cato had always been a figure of authority within the community, the head driver, the man who stood between the field hands and the overseer's power. But his authority had always been understood as a form of service, a mediation on behalf of the community. What he was doing now felt different. It felt like something done for himself alone. There was a woman named Nora who worked in the main house kitchen, who had been at Greyfield longer than Cato. She had come with the plantation when Edmund Voss first established it, and she was, in the informal hierarchy of the enslaved community, a figure of considerable standing. She was perhaps 45 years old in 1847, a small, compact woman with a way of moving through the kitchen that suggested she was always thinking 3 steps ahead of whatever she was currently doing. She had watched the dinner table arrangement develop from the beginning, and she had said nothing about it to anyone. Not because she had nothing to say, but because she was, in her own way, as patient as Cato. One evening in January of 1848, she found an opportunity to speak to him alone. It was late. After the supper, things had been cleared, and Cato was crossing the yard between the main house and the cotton house. Nora was at the well, drawing water for the morning's work. "You know what you're doing," she said. It was not a question. "I know what I'm doing," Cato agreed. "And when it's done," she asked, "when whatever you're working toward is finished, what happens to the rest of us?" Cato was quiet for a moment. The night was cold, the kind of cold that came off the marsh in January and settled into the bones, and his breath made small clouds in the darkness. "Nothing changes for the rest of you," he said finally. "That's not what this is." Nora looked at him for a long moment. "You sure about that?" "No," he said, "but it's what I intend." She went back to drawing her water, and he went back to the cotton house, and neither of them spoke of it again. What Cato intended, what he had been working toward, with the patience and precision that characterized everything he did, was something that had no name in the vocabulary of 1848. It was not freedom, exactly, or not only freedom. It was something more specific than that, and more dangerous. He intended to survive Greyfield, not to escape it. Escape was a different kind of calculation, with different risks and different odds, and Cato had thought about it carefully and set it aside. The geography of the Low Country was not favorable to escape. The marsh was impassable without a boat, and boats were watched. The roads north were long and dangerous, and a man of Cato's height and appearance would be remembered everywhere he stopped. The Underground Railroad existed. Cato knew this, in the way that all enslaved people in the Low Country knew it, through whispers and coded language and the occasional absence of someone who had been there the day before. But it was not a reliable mechanism, and it required a kind of trust in strangers that Cato, who had learned to trust almost no one, found difficult to extend. No. What Cato intended was something different. He intended to make himself so essential to the functioning of Greyfield and to the personal security of Harlan Voss that the ordinary mechanisms of the plantation system would be unable to touch him. He intended to construct, through years of careful work, a position so singular and so necessary that the question of his status, enslaved or free, property or person, would become, in practical terms, irrelevant. It was an audacious plan. It was, in many ways, an impossible plan. And it was working. The dinner table was not the beginning of it. The dinner table was a consequence, a visible symptom of something that had been developing for years, in the ledgers and the cotton house and the careful management of Harlan Voss's financial affairs. Because what Cato had done, over the course of nearly a decade, was make himself indispensable not just to the operation of the plantation, but to the financial survival of its owner. He had done this in ways that were individually unremarkable. He had caught errors in the factors' accounts, errors that, if left uncorrected, would have cost Harlan Voss significant sums. He had identified, 3 years running, the optimal timing for the harvest that maximized the quality of the fiber and therefore the price it commanded in Charleston. He had managed the labor force with a skill that kept productivity high, and the kind of catastrophic breakdowns, illness, injury, the slow erosion of morale that could devastate a harvest, at a minimum. He had done all of this without ever making it explicit, without ever presenting himself as anything other than a capable driver doing his job. But Harlan Voss was not a stupid man. He had noticed. And in the autumn of 1847, when the harvest came in and the numbers were better than they had been in years, he had made a calculation of his own. The calculation was this: Cato was worth more to him at the table than in the field. Not in any sentimental sense. Not out of gratitude or affection or any of the softer emotions that later generations would sometimes project onto these arrangements, looking for something redemptive in a story that had very little redemption in it. It was a purely practical calculation. Cato's presence at the table, his participation in the conversations about the plantation's management, his access to information that Harlan Voss needed, was worth more than whatever social cost the arrangement imposed. And the social cost, as it turned out, was manageable. Because Harlan Voss had something that made the neighbors and the ministers and the county sheriff reluctant to press the matter. He had Reginald Haverstock. Reginald Haverstock had, in the spring of 1846, come to Greyfield with a proposition. The proposition concerned a piece of land, a parcel of approximately 200 acres that lay between Greyfield's eastern boundary and the edge of the Haverstock holdings in Colleton district. The land was not particularly valuable in itself. It was low and marshy, difficult to cultivate, but it occupied a position that was strategically important to both plantations, controlling access to a tidal creek that both properties used for the transport of cotton bales to the river landing. Haverstock wanted to buy it. He had been trying to buy it for years, from the widow of the man who had originally owned it, a woman named Mrs. Delacroix, who was elderly and in declining health, and who had, for reasons she never explained, consistently refused to sell. When Mrs. Delacroix died in the winter of 1845, the land passed to her nephew, a young man named Philip Delacroix, who lived in Savannah and had no particular attachment to the Low Country or its complicated land arrangements. Haverstock had approached him immediately, but Harlan Voss had gotten there first. He had purchased the Delacroix parcel in February of 1846, 2 weeks before Haverstock's agent arrived in Savannah to make an offer. The price he had paid was fair, not extravagant, but fair, and the transaction was entirely legal. But Haverstock had taken it as a personal affront, and the visit to Greyfield in the spring of that year had been ostensibly an attempt to negotiate some arrangement by which Haverstock could gain access to the creek. The negotiation had not gone well. Harlan Voss had been polite but firm. The land was his, the creek was his, and he had no interest in sharing either. Haverstock had left after 3 days in a mood that the household staff at Greyfield described carefully as cold. What had happened in the study on the second night of that visit was not part of any negotiation. What had happened in the study was this: Reginald Haverstock, in the grip of a rage that the whiskey he had been drinking all evening had not helped to moderate, had said something to Harlan Voss, something specific, something that concerned a transaction that had taken place several years earlier, a transaction involving the sale of an enslaved person from Haverstock's holdings to a buyer in New Orleans, a transaction that had been recorded in the official documents as a voluntary sale, but that had been, in fact, something considerably more complicated and considerably more illegal. The details of what Haverstock had said, the precise nature of the transaction he had described, and what it implied about his own conduct and about the conduct of at least 2 other men in the county, were things that Cato had heard through the open window of the cotton house on a still spring night in 1846. He had heard them clearly because Haverstock had not been speaking quietly, and because the night had been warm, and the windows of the study had been opened to catch whatever breeze came off the marsh. He had heard Haverstock threaten Harlan Voss. Not with violence. Haverstock was not that kind of man, or at least not in that moment. He had threatened him with exposure. He had told Harlan Voss that if the land dispute was not resolved in his favor, he would make certain information public. Information that concerned Harlan Voss's father, Edmund, and a series of transactions that Edmund had conducted in the years before his death. Transactions that had involved the falsification of certain legal documents related to the ownership and transfer of enslaved people. The falsification had been done to conceal a debt. Edmund Voss had owed money, a great deal of money, to a man in Virginia, and he had settled that debt through a transaction that was, under the laws of South Carolina, fraudulent. The transaction had been witnessed by Reginald Haverstock's father, who had since died, but who had left behind a written account of what he had seen, an account that Reginald now possessed and was prepared to use. If the information became public, the legal consequences for Harlan Voss, who had inherited both the plantation and, arguably, the liability for his father's fraudulent transactions, would be severe. The land could be seized, the debts could be called in. Greyfield, in the worst case, could be lost entirely. Harlan Voss had listened to all of this in silence, and then he had said very quietly that he would think about it. Haverstock had left the next morning, and Harlan Voss had spent the following months thinking about it with the focused, methodical attention of a man who understood that he was in a very dangerous position and that his options were limited. What he had not known, what he could not have known, was that someone else had already heard everything Haverstock had said, and had been thinking about it too. Cato had spent the months between the spring of 1846 and the autumn of 1847 doing something that required extraordinary patience and extraordinary nerve. He had been quietly, carefully, systematically gathering every piece of information he could find about the transactions Edmund Voss had conducted, the fraudulent ones, the ones that Haverstock was threatening to expose. He had done this through the ledgers, through the correspondence that passed through the Cotton House, through the careful reading of documents that Harlan Voss kept in a locked box in the study, but that were occasionally brought out for reference and left briefly unattended. By the autumn of 1847, Cato knew as much about Edmund Voss's fraudulent transactions as Reginald Haverstock did. Possibly more. And he knew something else, something that Haverstock did not know, and that Harlan Voss did not know, and that no one at Greyfield knew except Cato himself. He knew where the original documents were, not Haverstock's copy, the written account that Haverstock's father had left behind. The originals, the actual falsified records, the ones that Edmund Voss had created and then hidden, believing that hidden was the same as destroyed. They were not destroyed. They were in a place that Cato had found, years earlier, in the course of his work in the Cotton House. A place that Edmund Voss had used as a hiding spot and that his son had apparently never discovered. Cato had not touched them. He had simply noted where they were and waited. In the autumn of 1847 he had gone to Harlan Voss. He had not gone with threats. He had not gone with demands. He had gone with information, specific, precise, carefully organized information about the state of Harlan Voss's legal exposure and about what could be done to address it. He had laid out in the quiet, methodical way that characterized everything he did, exactly what he knew and exactly what he was prepared to do with it. And then he had made a proposal. The proposal was not complicated. In exchange for certain arrangements that included, but were not limited to, a seat at the dinner table, Cato would help Harlan Voss navigate the threat that Haverstock represented. He would help him find a way to neutralize it, using the information and the documents that Cato had access to. He would do this not because he had any loyalty to Harlan Voss or any investment in the survival of Greyfield as it currently existed, but because it served his own purposes to do so. Harlan Voss had listened to all of this, and then he had done something that surprised even Cato. He had laughed. Not a warm laugh, not an amused laugh, a short, sharp sound that had more in common with a cough than with genuine laughter. And then he had said, "You've been planning this for a long time." "Yes, sir," Cato had said. "How long?" Cato had considered the question. "Since I was about 15, he said. Harlan Voss had looked at him for a long moment, and then he had said, "All right." Just that. All right. And the arrangement had begun. The winter of 1848 was cold by low country standards. Not the killing cold of the northern states, but a damp, penetrating chill that settled into the old plantation house and refused to leave. The fireplaces in the main rooms burned constantly, and the smell of wood smoke mixed with the salt air from the marsh to create an atmosphere that was, in its way, suffocating. Thomas Voss had begun to drink. He was 18 by January of 1848, old enough to have formed a clear picture of what was happening at Greyfield and young enough to find it intolerable. He was not a cruel young man. He had his mother's contained quality, her tendency to feel things deeply without expressing them. But he had grown up in a world that had given him a very specific set of expectations about how that world worked, and what was happening at his father's dinner table violated every one of those expectations in ways that he could not articulate and could not ignore. He had tried, once, to speak to his father about it. The conversation had been brief. "It's a business arrangement," Harlan Voss had said. "You don't need to understand it." "I understand enough," Thomas had said. His father had looked at him with an expression that Thomas would remember for the rest of his life. Not anger, not contempt, but something that was almost pity. "No," Harlan Voss had said quietly. "You don't." Thomas had not raised the subject again. Instead, he had begun spending his evenings away from the main house, at the tavern in Beaufort, at the homes of neighbors, anywhere that was not the dining room of Greyfield. His drinking was not yet severe, but it was noticed, and it was understood by those who noticed it as a symptom of something that no one wanted to name directly. Clara Voss, who was 15 by this point, had developed a different response. She had become intensely, almost obsessively, observant. She watched Cato at the dinner table with the focused attention of someone trying to solve a puzzle, cataloging his gestures and his words and his silences with a thoroughness that was, for a 15-year-old girl in 1848, remarkable. She had begun keeping a journal, a practice that her mother had encouraged as a suitable occupation for a young woman of her station. But the journal had become something considerably more than a record of social calls and weather observations. It had become a document of everything Clara saw and heard at Greyfield, written in a hand that grew more precise and more analytical as the months passed. It was Clara's journal that would eventually provide the most detailed account of what happened at Greyfield in the years that followed. It was Clara's journal that would be found, 60 years later, tucked inside the lining of a traveling trunk in the attic of a house in Beaufort, found by a woman who was Clara's granddaughter, who read it with growing disbelief, and who then, after a period of considerable deliberation, chose not to share it with anyone outside her immediate family. The journal survived in fragments because Clara's granddaughter could not quite bring herself to destroy it. But it did not become public until much later, and by then, the people it described were long dead, and the world they had inhabited was gone. And the story it told had the quality of something that had happened in a dream, vivid and specific and impossible to fully believe. What Clara wrote in the winter of 1848 was this: "He watches everything. I do not think Father understands how much he watches. I do not think anyone does except perhaps Nora, and Nora does not speak of it. He sat at supper tonight, and Father asked him about the eastern fields, and he answered in a way that made Father nod, and I thought, he knows more about this plantation than Father does. He knows more about everything here than any of us, and I do not know what he intends to do with that knowledge, but I am certain, I am more certain of this than I have been of almost anything, that he intends something." She was right, and what he intended was about to become considerably more visible. In March of 1848, Reginald Haverstock came back to Greyfield. He had not been invited. He arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, unannounced, riding up the long avenue of live oaks that led to the main house with the air of a man who had decided that the time for patience was over. He was accompanied by a lawyer from Beaufort, a man named Gideon Taft, who carried a leather satchel and who had the look of someone who had been told just enough about the situation to be useful and not quite enough to be comfortable. Harlan Voss received them in the parlor. He was calm. The household staff noted this afterward, the unusual quality of his calm, the sense that he had been expecting this visit and had prepared for it. He offered Haverstock a chair and a glass of bourbon and waited. Haverstock did not waste time. He told Harlan Voss that he had decided to move forward with his threat, that he had instructed Taft to prepare the necessary documents for filing with the county court, documents that would initiate a legal proceeding based on the evidence of Edmund Voss's fraudulent transactions. He told him that the proceeding, once initiated, would be difficult to stop and that the consequences for Greyfield would be severe. He told him that there was still time to avoid all of this, if Harlan Voss was prepared to be reasonable about the land. Harlan Voss listened to all of this. He sipped his bourbon. He looked at Haverstock with the same expression, that quality of almost pity, that he had shown his son in January. And then he said, "I'd like you to meet someone." He called for Cato. Cato came into the parlor, not from outside, not from the cotton house, but from the study where he had apparently been waiting. He was carrying a leather folder and he sat down in a chair across from Haverstock and Taft with the same unhurried composure that he brought to everything. What happened next took approximately 40 minutes. Cato laid out, document by document, the full picture of Edmund Voss's fraudulent transactions, not the version that Haverstock had, the version based on his father's written account, but the original records themselves, the actual falsified documents that Edmund Voss had hidden in the cotton house and that Cato had been holding for years. He laid them out with a precision that made Taft, the lawyer, lean forward in his chair and put on his spectacles and look very carefully at what he was seeing. And then Cato laid out something else. He laid out a set of documents that concerned Reginald Haverstock himself, documents that described, in careful detail, the transaction that Haverstock had mentioned to Harlan Voss in the study 2 years earlier. The transaction involving the sale of an enslaved person from Haverstock's holdings to a buyer in New Orleans. The transaction that had been recorded as voluntary, but that had been, in fact, something else. What it had been, in fact, was a sale conducted in violation of a specific provision of South Carolina law, a provision that prohibited the sale of certain categories of enslaved people under certain circumstances. A provision that had been enacted in 1820 and that was, by 1848, still technically on the books, though rarely enforced. The violation was not trivial. It was the kind of violation that, if brought before the right court, could result in significant legal and financial consequences for the person who had committed it. Cato had found the evidence of this violation in the same place he had found everything else. In the fragments and ledger entries and overheard conversations that he had been collecting for years. He had not known, when he first found it, that it would be useful. He had simply noted it and filed it away, because that was what he did with everything. Haverstock looked at the documents for a long time. His face had gone through several changes during the course of Cato's presentation. Surprise, then anger, then something that was not quite fear but was close to it. Taft, beside him, had said nothing at all. He was looking at Cato with an expression that was difficult to read, something between professional assessment and genuine astonishment. "Where did you get these?" Haverstock said finally. Cato looked at him. "That's not relevant," he said. Haverstock turned to Harlan Voss. "You're going to let him speak to me like that?" Harlan Voss looked at his bourbon glass. "He's speaking the truth," he said. "It's not relevant." The silence that followed lasted a long time. Outside, the marsh was quiet in the way it got in early spring, a waiting kind of quiet, the kind that preceded the return of the birds from the south. A mockingbird called somewhere in the live oaks, and then was silent. Haverstock stood up. He picked up his hat. He looked at Cato one more time, a long look, the kind that was trying to categorize something that refused to fit into any available category. And then he walked out of the parlor without another word. Taft followed him, clutching his satchel, his face carefully blank. They rode back down the avenue of live oaks and did not return. The legal proceeding was never filed. The land dispute was never resolved in Haverstock's favor. And the story of what had happened in the parlor at Grayfield on that Tuesday afternoon in March of 1848 spread through the Low Country in the careful, oblique way that stories spread in communities where certain things cannot be said directly, through implication and inference and the significant silences of people who had heard something they were not sure they were supposed to have heard. What those people understood, without being able to articulate it precisely, was that something had shifted at Grayfield, something in the balance of things, and that the shift had been engineered by a man who was, by every legal and social definition available in 1848, the property of the man he had just helped. The summer of 1848 was the hottest in living memory in St. Helena Parish. The cotton grew well. It always grew well in heat, as long as the rain came at the right intervals. But the heat did something to the people at Grayfield that the cotton could not accommodate. It wore at them. It made the nights long and restless, and the days feel like something to be endured rather than lived. The household moved through its routines with a kind of mechanical persistence, and the dinner table continued its strange nightly ritual, and the silence around it continued to hold. But something was changing. Thomas Voss had come back from Beaufort one evening in July with a look on his face that his mother recognized immediately. The look of a man who had heard something and was deciding what to do with it. He had heard at the tavern a version of the story of what had happened with Haverstock in March. The version he had heard was incomplete and distorted, as such stories always were by the time they had passed through enough mouths, but the core of it was recognizable. He had heard that his father had used an enslaved man to threaten a neighbor. He had heard that the enslaved man had produced documents. He had heard that Haverstock had left without a word. He came home and went directly to his father's study. The conversation that followed was the longest and most consequential that Harlan Voss and his son had ever had. It lasted most of the night. Clara, whose room was adjacent to the study, heard fragments of it through the wall, not enough to reconstruct the whole, but enough to understand its general shape. She wrote about it in her journal the next morning, in the careful, precise hand that had become her habit. Father told Thomas something last night that I could not fully hear. Thomas's voice was loud at first and then became quiet, which is always more frightening than the loudness. I heard him say, near the end, "And what happens when he decides he wants more?" And I heard Father say, "He won't." And Thomas said, "How do you know?" And Father was quiet for a long time, and then he said something I could not make out. And then Thomas left, and I heard him go down the stairs and out the front door, and he did not come back until morning. Thomas's question, what happens when he decides he wants more, was the question that everyone at Greyfield had been not asking for the better part of a year. It was the question that lived in the silence around the dinner table, in the careful avoidance of Denton Frick, in the watchful eyes of Nora in the kitchen. It was the question that the story was always circling, always approaching, always pulling back from. The answer to that question, the real answer, the one that Harlan Voss had given his son in the study that night, was something that Clara did not hear, but it was something that became clear over the course of the following months, through its consequences. Harlan Voss had begun, quietly and without announcement, the process of manumitting Cato. Manumission, the legal freeing of an enslaved person, was not impossible in South Carolina in 1848, but it was not easy. The state had been steadily restricting the conditions under which it could occur since the early part of the century, and by the 1840s, the process required a petition to the state legislature, a demonstration of exceptional circumstances, and the approval of a committee that was not inclined to look favorably on such requests. It was a process that could take years and that could fail at any point, and that was, in the current political climate, with the tensions over slavery building toward what would eventually become the crisis of the 1850s, particularly fraught. Harlan Voss had begun the process anyway. He had done it through a lawyer in Charleston, not Taft, who was Haverstock's man, but a different lawyer, a man named Cornelius Pringle, who had a reputation for handling complicated matters with discretion. The petition had been filed quietly, without fanfare, and it had been working its way through the relevant channels for several months before anyone at Greyfield knew it existed. Cato knew. He had known almost from the beginning. Pringle had sent a letter to Greyfield that had passed through the Cotton House, and Cato had read it before forwarding it to the main house, as he read everything that passed through the Cotton House. He had read it and said nothing, and had continued to appear at the dinner table every evening, and had continued to manage the plantation's affairs with the same quiet competence that had characterized everything he did. But something had changed in him after he read that letter. Something that Clara noticed, though she could not have said exactly what it was, a quality of attention that had shifted slightly, a sense that the waiting, which had defined him for so long, was entering its final phase. The petition was approved in the spring of 1849. It was approved not because the committee was sympathetic to the principle of manumission, it was not, but because Harlan Voss had made a case that was, in its own way, as carefully constructed as everything else that had happened at Greyfield over the past 2 years. He had argued that Cato's services to the plantation were of a nature that could not be adequately compensated within the existing legal framework, and that the arrangement currently in place, the dinner table, the management role, the access to the plantation's financial affairs, was creating a situation that was, from a legal standpoint, ambiguous in ways that could cause problems. He had argued, in other words, that manumission was the tidiest solution to a complicated problem. The committee had accepted this argument with reservations, and the papers had been signed. On a morning in April of 1849, Cato was legally free. He was 29 years old. He had been enslaved for approximately 17 years. He had spent the last decade of those years constructing, with a patience and a precision that defied easy description, the conditions of his own liberation. He did not leave Greyfield immediately. This was the detail that people found most difficult to understand in the years that followed, the fact that he stayed. He stayed for another 6 months, through the summer and into the autumn, continuing to manage the plantation's affairs, continuing to appear at the dinner table, continuing to be, in all visible respects, exactly what he had been before. The difference was that now he was paid. Not generously. The arrangement was not generous, but in actual money. A wage that was recorded in the plantation's ledgers and that Cato kept in a small tin box in the cotton house. In October of 1849, he left. He did not make an announcement. He did not have a conversation with Harlan Voss about his departure, or if he did, no record of it survived. He simply packed what he owned, which was not much, and walked down the avenue of live oaks and did not come back. What happened to Cato after he left Greyfield is a matter of incomplete record. There is a man named Cato who appears in the records of the free black community in Charleston in the early 1850s. A man who worked as a factor's agent, handling accounts and correspondence for several of the smaller trading houses on the waterfront. The records describe him as tall, precise in his manner, and exceptionally competent with figures. Whether this is the same man is impossible to say with certainty. The records do not provide a surname, and the description, while consistent, is not conclusive. There is also a reference in a letter written by Cornelius Pringle to a colleague in 1853 to a former client of unusual ability who had established himself in the commercial life of Charleston and who had, in Pringle's estimation, a clearer understanding of the workings of this city's financial arrangements than most men who have spent their entire lives within them. Pringle does not name the man, but the timing and the description are suggestive. Beyond these fragments, the trail goes cold. Greyfield itself continued for another decade and a half, until the Civil War made the plantation economy of the Low Country impossible to sustain. Harlan Voss died in 1857 of a heart ailment that his doctor attributed to the accumulated stresses of a life spent managing a large agricultural operation in a period of increasing political instability. Thomas Voss attempted to run the plantation after his father's death, but he lacked both the temperament and the knowledge that had for years resided primarily in the man who had sat at the dinner table and was now gone. By 1861, Greyfield was struggling. By 1865, it was finished. Margaret Voss lived until 1871. Clara married a man from Beaufort in 1855 and moved to his family's property, where she continued to keep her journal until the end of her life. The journal passed to her daughter, and then to her granddaughter, and then into the lining of a traveling trunk in an attic, where it waited for 60 years. Denton Frick left Greyfield in 1850, the year after Cato's departure, and took a position as overseer on a plantation in Georgia. He never spoke publicly about what he had witnessed at Greyfield. In a letter to his brother, written sometime in the early 1850s and preserved in a family collection in Savannah, he wrote, "I have seen things in this work that I would not have believed possible, and the strangest of them was at a place in Beaufort district where a man did something that I still cannot entirely account for. I will not write it down, but I think about it." Nora remained at Greyfield until the end. She was freed by the terms of the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and she stayed on the property for several years afterward, working for wages in the household of the family that had purchased what remained of the plantation from Thomas Voss's creditors. She died in 1871, the same year as Margaret Voss, and was buried in the small cemetery at the edge of the property where the enslaved community of Greyfield had buried its dead for 30 years. No one recorded what she thought about any of it. She had, as always, kept her own counsel. The county courthouse records that might have provided a clearer picture of the legal proceedings, the manumission petition, the Haverstock dispute, the various financial transactions that Cato had navigated, were destroyed in a fire in 1879. The fire was officially attributed to a lamp left burning in the records room overnight. Several people who were alive at the time expressed private doubts about this explanation, but no investigation was conducted, and the matter was closed. What remained after everything was the question that Thomas Voss had asked his father on that hot July night in 1848, through the wall of the study while Clara listened. What happens when he decides he wants more? Harlan Voss's answer, the one that Clara had not been able to hear, was never recorded. But the events that followed suggested what it might have been, because what Cato had wanted from the beginning was not more. He had wanted exactly what he had planned for, from the age of 15, with a patience and a precision that the world he lived in had given him no choice but to develop. He had wanted out, not revenge, not power over the people who had held power over him, not the satisfaction of watching Greyfield fail, though it did fail in the end, as all such things fail eventually, just out, free, gone. The dinner table, that strange, sinister, inexplicable arrangement that had scandalized the neighbors and silenced the ministers and left Denton Frick writing cryptic letters to his brother decades later, had been the price of that freedom, a calculated price, paid in patience and knowledge and the careful management of other people's secrets. A price that Cato had determined, years before anyone else understood what was happening, was the one he was willing to pay. Whether it was worth it, whether any of it was worth it, whether the years of waiting and watching and holding his knowledge like a stone in his chest were worth the freedom that came at the end of them, that is a question that the record does not answer. It cannot answer. The record is too incomplete, the silence is too deep, the man himself too carefully absent from the documents that survived. But there is one more thing. One detail that Clara recorded in her journal. On the morning after Cato left Greyfield in October of 1849, she had watched him go from her window, had seen him walk down the avenue of live oaks in the early morning light, carrying a small bundle, not looking back. She wrote, "He did not look back. Not once. I watched until he was gone from sight, and he never turned." I have been trying to decide what that means, and I think I have decided. It means that he had already said goodbye to this place a long time ago. He was just waiting for his body to catch up. She closed the journal. She did not write in it again for 3 days. And somewhere down the avenue of live oaks, in the early morning light of an October day in 1849, a man who had spent 17 years building the conditions of his own freedom walked away from the place that had held him and did not look back, and was gone. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Or do you think there are layers here that the record, deliberately or otherwise, chose not to preserve? Leave your comment below. The story of Cato and Greyfield is one that history swallowed almost whole, and the fragments that remain raise more questions than they answer. If you want more stories like this, stories that live in the space between what we know and what we can only suspect, subscribe to this channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves the kind of mystery that doesn't need the supernatural to be deeply, genuinely unsettling. We'll see you in the next one.